Max Dalton crouched beside the shattered remnants of his transport vessel, scanning the jagged landscape for any sign of movement. The planet's sky was a sickly green, its two suns casting sharp, overlapping shadows that made judging distances a headache. His leg ached from where he'd banged it during the crash, but that wasn't his main concern. He was down to 3 ration bars, and he hadn't seen a single edible thing since setting foot on this rock. Worse, his distress beacon wasn't transmitting. "Great job, Dalton," he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Stranded on a planet that smells like burnt rubber with no way off." "Fantastic." A low, guttural sound cut through the silence, making him freeze. It came from somewhere beyond a ridge of crumbled rocks ahead. Max tightened his grip on his multi-tool, a glorified pocket knife with a few extra features, and cautiously made his way toward the noise. He wasn't alone out here, and he figured it was better to find out what was making that sound before it found him. When he crested the ridge, he spotted it. A massive quadruped lay pinned under a chunk of his transport's hull. Its leathery skin was covered in shallow cuts, and its faintly glowing eyes flicked toward him, wide and desperate. The creature let out another low rumble, a mix between a growl and a whimper. It was clearly in pain. Max stood there for a long moment, every survival instinct screaming at him to back away. The thing was huge, easily the size of a small car, and it had sharp claws and a mouth full of jagged teeth. Helping it was risky, not to mention stupid. He didn't even know if this thing ate meat, and with his luck, he'd be on the menu as soon as he frayed it. But then he noticed its breathing was shallow, labored. It wasn't going to last much longer. Against his better judgment, Max slid down the ridge toward the creature, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "All right, big guy," he said, his voice low and steady. "I don't know if you can understand me, but I'm not here to hurt you. Let's see what we can do about this mess." The creature's glowing eyes tracked him but didn't show aggression. Max knelt next to it and inspected the debris pinning its hindquarters. The metal was twisted and jagged, and it was obvious the beast wouldn't be able to move without help. He sighed and pulled out his multi-tool. This is such a bad idea. In an orbiting observation lab high above the planet, a group of Xyreen scientists watched the scene unfold on their monitors. The Xyreen were a bioluminescent, insectoid species with an unshakable belief in logic and efficiency. This particular experiment was designed to study human responses to survival scenarios, and so far, Max's actions had left them baffled. "Why is he approaching the beast?" one of them, Drake, asked, his voice a rapid clicking sound that translated into crisp galactic standard. "It poses no benefit to his survival. If anything, it increases his risk." Another Xyreen, Lyric, tilted his head as he analyzed Max's behavior. Perhaps he intends to harvest the creature for sustenance. "Humans are known to consume other life forms." "No," Drake countered. "He lacks the tools to efficiently process a carcass of that size. This behavior is irrational." The room buzzed with quiet confusion as they continued to watch. Max managed to wedge his multi-tool into the edge of the debris and pry it upward, using a nearby rock as leverage. It took everything he had, but after several minutes of straining and cursing under his breath, the chunk of metal shifted just enough for the creature to wriggle free. It collapsed onto its side, panting heavily. Max sat back, exhausted. "You're welcome," he said dryly, wiping sweat from his face. "Try not to eat me now, all right?" The creature didn't move apart from its heaving breaths. Max noticed how thin it looked, its rib-like structures visible beneath its skin. It was starving. "Yeah, join the club," he muttered, reaching into his pack. He hesitated for a moment, staring at one of his precious ration bars. He only had 3 left, and there was no guarantee he'd find more before he was in the same state as the creature in front of him. But then he looked back at those glowing eyes, now half closed. With a resigned sigh, he unwrapped the bar and held it out. Here. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. The beast sniffed the offering warily before lapping it up with a surprisingly gentle motion. Max chuckled, "Guess you've got good taste." "That's the last peanut butter one." He sat beside the creature as it ate, keeping a cautious distance but feeling oddly satisfied. When it finished, it let out a low, rumbling sound and slumped onto the ground, its eyes closing. Max wasn't sure if it was sleeping or dying, but he figured he'd done what he could. "Well, you look like a Hank to me," he said, more to himself than the creature. "Yeah, you're definitely a Hank kind of guy." "Don't ask me why." Hank didn't respond, but for the first time since the crash, Max didn't feel completely alone. Max trudged through the cracked, violet soil, his pack digging into his shoulders and his multi-tool clipped to his belt. The two suns were slipping below the horizon, staining the sky a bruised orange, and the temperature was already plummeting. Nights on this planet were brutal, and he needed to find shelter soon. He glanced over his shoulder and wasn't surprised to see Hank trailing behind him at a cautious distance. The beast had been following him for 3 days now. At first, Max thought it was just some instinctual predator behavior. Maybe Hank was waiting for him to keel over so he could turn him into dinner. But Hank never made a move. If anything, the creature seemed protective in its own lumbering, alien way. Its injuries were healing, albeit slowly, and it still looked thin, but there was a strength in the way it moved that hadn't been there before. Max wasn't sure how to feel about it. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," he muttered, more to himself than to Hank. The creature's glowing eyes blinked in response and Max shook his head. "Don't look at me like that. I'm not your babysitter." Despite his words, Max had stopped trying to shoo Hank away. Maybe it was because the beast didn't seem threatening anymore. Or maybe it was because, deep down, he appreciated the company. Either way, Hank had become an unspoken part of his routine, a shadow that didn't feel quite so oppressive. Higher above, far beyond the atmosphere, the Xyreen scientists observed with a mixture of fascination and frustration. The experiment had taken an unexpected turn, and none of their models could accurately predict what would happen next. "The creature is exhibiting attachment behavior," Larrick said, his mandibles clicking in a pattern that conveyed both intrigue and confusion. "It follows the human despite its injuries, despite the lack of immediate benefit. It could be a survival mechanism," Drake suggested. "The creature may recognize that the human is a source of sustenance and protection." Zarnak, the lead scientist, crossed his segmented arms and leaned closer to the monitor displaying Max and Hank's movements. "If that were the case, the human would have eliminated the creature by now or abandoned it entirely. Instead, he continues to tolerate its presence. This defies logic. Perhaps the human intends to use the creature for his own protection," Larrick offered. Zarnak made a dismissive motion with one clawed hand. "Unlikely. Humans are known for their resourcefulness, but this behavior is inefficient. There must be another explanation." The Xyreen continued to watch in silence as the human and the beast pressed on. Max spotted a cluster of jagged rock formations up ahead and quickened his pace. The rocks would provide some shelter from the wind and the bitter cold of night. As he approached, he pulled out his multi-tool and scanned the area for any signs of danger. The last thing he needed was to stumble into another predator's territory, and speaking of predators. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows of the rocks. Max froze, his heart pounding. A second growl joined the first, and then another. 3 sets of glowing, amber eyes emerged from the darkness, accompanied by lean, sinewy forms with elongated snouts and razor-sharp claws. These creatures were nothing like Hank. They moved with a predatory grace, their muscles rippling beneath sleek, black fur. They had him surrounded. Max took a slow step back, his hand tightening around his multi-tool. "All right, fellas," he said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "Let's not do anything we'll all regret." The creatures didn't seem interested in negotiating. The largest of the three lunged forward, its jaws snapping, and Max braced himself for the worst. But before the predator could reach him, Hank barreled into it with a force that sent both creatures tumbling across the ground. The other two predators hesitated for a moment, their amber eyes narrowing as they assessed this new threat. Hank rose to his full height, his glowing eyes blazing, and let out a deafening roar that reverberated through the rocks. The predators didn't back down. They attacked in unison, their claws flashing in the dim light. Hank fought with a ferocity that Max hadn't seen before, his movements surprisingly agile for a creature of his size. He used his massive frame as a shield, placing himself between Max and the attackers, and his claws tore through fur and flesh with brutal efficiency. Max could only watch in stunned silence as the fight unfolded. It was over in a matter of minutes. Two of the predators lay dead, their sleek bodies motionless on the ground, while the third slunk away, limping and growling in defeat. Hank stood victorious, his sides heaving and his dark skin streaked with fresh wounds. "Holy, Hank, you okay?" Max finally managed, stepping forward cautiously. The beast turned to look at him, its glowing eyes softening, and let out a low, rumbling sound that Max could only interpret as reassurance. "Guess I owe you one," he said, his voice quieter now. "You didn't have to do that." Hank blinked slowly and lowered himself onto his haunches, clearly exhausted. Max hesitated for a moment before digging into his pack and pulling out one of his remaining ration bars. He broke it in half and held a piece out to Hank. "This doesn't make us even," he said, his tone somewhere between teasing and sincere. "But, thanks." Hank sniffed the offering before accepting it, his movements careful and deliberate. Max sat beside him, unwrapping the other half of the bar for himself. The silence between them was companionable, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. "You know," Max said after a long pause, his voice almost lost in the stillness, "I'm not even sure why I helped you back there. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I was just tired of watching things die." Hank didn't respond, at least not in a way Max could understand, but there was something in the way the beast looked at him, something that felt almost human. Far above, the Xyreen scientists were no closer to understanding the dynamic unfolding before them. "This does not align with any known behavioral patterns," Drake said, his tone laced with frustration. "It is illogical," Zarnak agreed, his glowing eyes narrowing. "The human sacrifices resources and safety for a creature that offers no measurable advantage. What purpose does this serve?" Larrick tilted his head, his bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly. "Perhaps humans are not as logical as we assumed." Zarnak didn't respond. He simply watched as Max and Hank settled into their temporary shelter, the human sharing his meager provisions with the creature that had saved his life. The scene raised more questions than answers, and for the first time in his long scientific career, Zarnak found himself at a loss. Max sat cross-legged on the ground, a gutted panel of his ship's control console spread out in front of him. He squinted at the tangled mess of wires, their insulation frayed and brittle from the crash. His fingers worked carefully, stripping and reconnecting pieces, trying to coax the beacon back to life. The tiny soldering iron in his multi-tool sparked faintly as he fused two particularly stubborn wires, and he leaned back to inspect his work. "All right," he mumbled, more to himself than anything else. Moment of truth. He pressed the activation switch, holding his breath. The beacon hummed weakly to life, a flickering red light pulsing in uneven intervals. But before Max could start feeling hopeful, the device sputtered, sparked, and went dark. A thin trail of smoke curled from the burnt-out casing. Max groaned and buried his face in his hands. Fantastic. Just fantastic. Hank, who had been lounging nearby with his massive frame sprawled across a patch of sunlit ground, lifted his head at the sound of Max's frustration. The beast let out a low, questioning rumble, its glowing eyes fixed on the human. "If anyone's listening," Max said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he gestured toward the ruined beacon, "I've officially gone crazy. I'm sharing my last protein bar with a space dog, and now I'm talking to it like it has a degree in engineering." He glanced at Hank, who tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. "What, you got a better idea?" Hank didn't answer, obviously, but the timing of his gentle rumble could almost be mistaken for approval. Max sighed, leaning back on his hands and staring up at the sky. The twin suns were nearing their zenith, their light harsh and unrelenting. His chances of being found out here were getting slimmer by the minute. Without a functional beacon, he was nothing more than a speck lost in an infinite void. For a moment, the weight of it all threatened to crush him. The loneliness, the hopelessness, the sheer absurdity of his situation. He wanted to give up, to just lie down and let the elements have their way with him. But then he felt Hank's warm, solid presence beside him, the beast's breath slow and steady. The unflinching loyalty in those glowing eyes reminded Max that giving up wasn't an option, not for him, and not for the creature that had saved his life. All right, Max muttered, pushing himself to his feet. "Pity party's over. If that hunk of junk can't work as a beacon, maybe I can build something else." He spent the next few hours scavenging parts from the wreckage of his ship, with Hank trailing after him like a curious, oversized puppy. The creature's intelligence continued to surprise Max. Hank seemed to understand what he was looking for, sniffing out useful bits of metal and wiring, and even prying open a mangled panel with his claws to retrieve a bundle of intact circuits. "You really are full of surprises, aren't you?" Max said, crouching to take the circuits from Hank's jaws. The beast's tail, a thick, muscular appendage that could probably snap bones if it wanted to give a faint wag. Max chuckled, despite himself. "Guess you're not just a big dumb lizard after all." Hank let out a soft chuff, his glowing eyes narrowing slightly, and Max could have sworn the creature was offended. He smirked. "Relax, I'm kidding. You're smarter than most people I know." By the time the suns dipped below the horizon, Max had managed to cobble together a rudimentary signal transmitter. It wasn't pretty, a lopsided array of scavenged metal and wires perched atop a makeshift tripod, but it might just work. He connected the power source and flipped the switch, holding his breath as the device powered on. A faint, rhythmic pulse filled the air, and a tiny green light blinked steadily. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Not bad for a guy with no formal training," Max said, grinning as he wiped the sweat from his brow. He turned to Hank, who was watching the transmitter with what Max could only describe as curious approval. "And not bad for a space dog who doesn't even have thumbs." Hank rumbled softly in response, settling down beside Max as the two of them watched the blinking light. For the first time in days, Max felt a flicker of hope. The Xyreen scientists were less impressed. Zarnak's mandibles clicked in irritation, as he reviewed the data streaming in from their observation equipment. The human's actions continue to defy logic, Xyreen said, his glowing eyes narrowing. Instead of prioritizing his own survival, he expends valuable resources to sustain the creature. And now, he appears to be relying on it as if it were a partner. Drake tilted his head, his bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly. Perhaps there is a symbiotic relationship developing. The creature provides physical protection and the human provides sustenance. But that does not explain the emotional connection, Lyric interjected, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. The human speaks to the creature as if it were an equal, even expressing gratitude and humor. These are not traits of a purely symbiotic relationship. Xyreen made a dismissive gesture with one clawed hand. Humans are known for their irrational behavior. This is simply another example of their inefficiency. But as he watched Max and Hank resting beneath the alien sky, the human's hand absently patting the beast's flank, Xyreen couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that there was more to this bond than mere survival. The next morning, Max woke to find Hank nudging his shoulder gently with his snout. The beast's glowing eyes were sharp and alert, and it let out a low, urgent growl. "What is it, buddy?" Max asked, sitting up and wincing as his muscles protested. Hank stepped back, his tail swishing nervously, and Max followed his gaze to the horizon. A dark shape was moving toward them, its outline barely visible against the shimmering heat waves. As it drew closer, Max's stomach sank. It was another predator, larger than any he'd seen before, its scales glinting like obsidian in the harsh sunlight. The scars crisscrossing its body suggested it was a seasoned killer, and its glowing amber eyes locked onto Max with unsettling focus. "Of course," Max muttered, grabbing his multi-tool. Because things weren't bad enough already. Hank placed himself squarely between Max and the approaching predator, his massive frame tensed and ready. The beast let out a roar that echoed across the barren landscape, a sound that sent shivers down Max's spine. The predator hesitated for a moment, its amber eyes narrowing, before lunging forward with terrifying speed. The battle that followed was brutal and chaotic. Hank fought with a ferocity that Max hadn't thought possible, his claws and teeth flashing as he drove the predator back again and again. Max did his best to stay out of the way, but when the predator managed to land a deep gash across Hank's side, he couldn't just stand by. "Hey!" Max shouted, hurling a jagged piece of metal at the creature. It struck the predator's flank, drawing its attention just long enough for Hank to land a devastating blow. The predator let out a pained howl before retreating, its massive body limping into the distance. Max rushed to Hank's side, his hands shaking as he inspected the beast's injuries. "You okay, big guy?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. Hank let out a low rumble, his glowing eyes half closed but resolute. "You're a damn hero," Max said, his voice cracking. "But don't make a habit of this, all right? I can't lose you too." Hank rumbled again, and despite the pain evident in his movements, his tail gave the faintest of wags. The retrieval pod descended like a streak of silver fire, its thrusters kicking up swirling clouds of violet dust as it landed 100 meters from Max's makeshift camp. The sharp hiss of decompressing air followed, and its sleek, seamless hatch slid open with an eerie smoothness. Max, crouched behind a cluster of jagged rocks, tightened his grip on his multi-tool, his pulse hammering in his ears. Hank stood beside him, low to the ground, his glowing eyes locked on the craft with an intensity that vibrated through his massive frame. "Don't like this one bit," Max whispered, glancing at Hank, who let out a low, warning rumble. "You and me both, buddy." From the pod emerged three figures, their insectoid forms gleaming under the harsh light of the rising suns. The Xyreen. Their elongated limbs and bioluminescent patterns gave them an otherworldly elegance. But there was something disconcertingly cold about the way they moved. Precise, calculated, like every step was part of an intricate algorithm. The leader among them, taller than the others, and marked by a faint turquoise glow along his exoskeleton, raised a delicate appendage in what seemed like a gesture of peace. "Human," the figure called, his voice clicking and hissing before the translator embedded in Max's wristband converted it into galactic standard. "We mean you no harm." Max didn't move, his jaw tightening. The Xyreen's glowing eyes scanned the landscape, unblinking, until they landed on the jagged rocks shielding Max and Hank. Another step forward. "We have been observing you, your survival, your choices, and your companion. We believe your situation may hold insights valuable to our understanding." Max slowly rose, his multi-tool still clutched in his hand. "Observing me," he demanded, his voice thick with disbelief and anger. "You've been watching this whole time, watching while I starved, while I fought to stay alive. You could have helped me, but you didn't?" "What kind of—" Hank growled, cutting him off, and Max realized the beast had stepped in front of him, its massive body angled defensively toward the Xyreen. The leader tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing in what might have been curiosity. "We were conducting research," the alien explained, his voice calm. "Intervention would have compromised the parameters of our study." "Research?" Max shouted, his voice rising. "I've been stuck on this hellhole for weeks because of some experiment. Do you have any idea what I've been through? What we've been through?" He jabbed a finger toward Hank, whose growl deepened as the Xyreen took another step closer. The leader hesitated, clearly calculating his next words. "Your survival instincts have been illuminating. But more than that, your bond with this creature is unprecedented. We did not anticipate such—" "Yeah, I bet you didn't," Max interrupted, his voice dripping with venom. "Because you don't get it. You don't understand what it means to look at someone something and decide their life matters. Even if it's not convenient. Even if it costs you." The Xyreen exchanged glances, their glowing eyes flickering in a way Max couldn't interpret. The leader finally spoke again, his tone more measured. "You saved it. You had no logical reason to do so, yet you did." "Why?" Max glanced at Hank, whose glowing eyes met his with an almost human gentleness. He took a deep breath, his anger cooling into something steadier. "Because you don't leave someone to die when you can help," he said simply. "Even if it's not someone." For the first time, the Xyreen seemed genuinely unsettled. The leader's appendages twitched faintly and his bioluminescent markings dimmed. "This empathy," he said, almost to himself. "It is not a concept we have fully grasped." "Well, maybe it's time you start," Max shot back. The leader straightened, his glowing eyes narrowing once more. "We propose an arrangement. You and the creature will accompany us back to our research facility. There, we can study this bond further and know—" Max's voice was firm, unyielding. "If you want to study something, study me, but Hank goes free." The Xyreen leader tilted his head again, clearly puzzled. "You are willing to separate from the creature?" "I didn't say that," Max replied, his jaw set. "I said he goes free. If he chooses to stay with me, that's up to him." "But you're not locking him in some lab." The Xyreen fell silent, their glowing eyes flickering as they processed his words. Then, to Max's surprise, Hank stepped forward. The beast's glowing eyes locked onto the leader's, and for a moment, the two seemed to communicate without words. Hank let out a soft, almost mournful rumble before turning and pressing his massive head gently against Max's shoulder. Max froze, his throat tightening. "You're sticking with me, huh?" he murmured, his hand resting on the beast's thick hide. Hank rumbled again, a sound that felt like agreement, and Max chuckled softly. "Guess I don't get a say in the matter." The Xyreen leader observed the exchange with what might have been awe, his bioluminescent patterns shifting faintly. Finally, he spoke. "Very well. The creature will remain with you. We will escort you both to human territory and provide safe passage." Max stared at him, his anger giving way to cautious relief. "Just like that, our understanding of humanity has been incomplete," the leader admitted. "This encounter has revealed much, but there is still more to learn. You have given us a new perspective, one we intend to explore further." Max nodded slowly, his grip on his multi-tool loosening. "All right," he said. "But if you try anything, we will not," the leader interrupted, his tone almost conciliatory. "You have my word." True to their promise, the Xyreen provided a small but well-equipped rescue ship for Max and Hank. As the craft ascended through the planet's toxic atmosphere, Max watched the barren landscape recede beneath them, a strange mix of relief and sadness washing over him. This place had nearly killed him, but it had also given him Hank. And as absurd as it sounded, he wasn't sure he'd have made it without the big guy. Hank lay sprawled across the floor of the ship's cabin, his massive frame taking up most of the available space. His wounds had been treated with Xyreen medical tech, and he seemed content, his glowing eyes half closed as he let out a soft, rhythmic rumble. Max leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond the viewport. He reached down, resting a hand on Hank's flank. "Looks like you're stuck with me now, buddy," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Hank rumbled in response, a sound that vibrated through the cabin like a quiet thunder. Max chuckled, the weight of the past weeks lifting just a little. Whatever came next, they'd face it together.